afternoon, and thank you, Tom, for inviting me and for giving me the opportunity to talk with the community here at Georgetown. I was born in D.C., about a mile and a half from here at Sibley Hospital, and grew up in D.C., went to school in D.C., worked in D.C., and then I decided I needed to go to the American heartland for a while. So I moved to Indiana and loved it, loved being at IU and in a college town like Bloomington. And the world looks different from Bloomington than it does from DC. And China looks different from here. When you're playing basketball on Sunday mornings and the people that you're playing with work in a factory who then lose their jobs to China, the elbows get sharper. And that doesn't happen here. We have permanent employment where there's no competition from us being hired by China, at least in the standard type of work like that. So what I wanted to do is share with you some of the work that we've been doing on high-tech innovation in China. Americans, Europeans, and others wax and wane on where China is going. There's some folks who think China's discovered the new secret sauce to economic development, and this century is going to be their century. There's others who think China is just, ladled down with way too much debt because of government intervention and a bottomless supply of credit, and then the views all in between. And if you're here in Wall Street, interest goes up and down, and one of the core issues has to do with, will China be able to go from being an assembler and basic manufacturer to being innovator, to not just assembling and making stuff that other people invent, but itself inventing, which has been a core issue of whether or not countries can go from being sort of a low middle income country to then being an advanced industrialized economy, which of course the Chinese would like to do. And high-tech also matters not only because of civilian and commercial economy, but it has lots of military applications as well. In fact, China has a leading small group now on civilian-military integration. It's basically a group that has two lists. It has all the good stuff that China has in the commercial economy that might have military applications, and all the things that they're using in the military that they might be able to commercialize, and trying to figure out how to get things going in both directions. So the Chinese are paying attention to this with amazing levels of attention. So what I want to do is share with you, to get the conversation started, work that we've been doing on this, and then open it up for conversation. Of course, anytime you've got a comment or question, feel free, write down. Don't hold back. If you wait till the end, then you'll be competing with everybody else, or we'll run out of time. As Professor McNauer said, whatever you'd like to talk about, whether it's specifically related to some detail or point or something else that interests you about China. So this project that we're doing is part of what we're calling the China Innovation Policy Series that our China team and the Technology Policy Program at CSIS are working on together. And it's we have a website you can go to. It's not a very technically advanced website, so we are more technically challenged than the Chinese. But essentially, the initial plan is to do 7 studies, 1 overview study of where China is going in technology innovation, and then 6 sectoral studies. And I'm going to present to you the overview today. I'm already in the midst of working on the industry studies. I've been traveling a lot lately. I spent 10 days going through China looking at electric vehicles, autonomous vehicles, and just came back from the West Coast doing the same thing. I plan to go to Detroit. All fun places. Actually, running through China is funner than going to Detroit, but you never know. Anyway, you can go to our website and you can see more about what we do. In Washington, there's lots of folks paying attention to Chinese technology policy. And I think if you know anything about China at all, just a little bit, you probably have heard of this plan called the Made in China 2025 plan. Is that something people have seen or heard about? Right. So even members of Congress will tell you Made in China 2025 is probably the first Chinese industrial policy plan they had ever heard of. And maybe even President Trump has heard of it. But like most things, he wouldn't be able to tell you exactly what's on page 2. But he knows what's on the cover. Anyway, a lot of organizations have been writing about Made in China 2025 and Chinese industrial policy. And the core focus of all of the reports is China breaking the rules. Is Chinese industrial policy make China operate in a way that's inconsistent with its global commitments? I think that's a reasonable question to ask, but it's a lawyerly question to ask. It's what lobbyists ask, who represent competitors to China. And you know, if you're going to have a conversation with the Chinese that says, you know, what you're doing is all good and well, but you're breaking the rules, the Chinese are just going to say, well, tough, right? So it doesn't really make it's really not useful to have a conversation with the Chinese that's simply about the rules, that takes what they do and puts a list next to what they do. Instead, if you want to have a serious conversation, a better question to ask is what China is doing effective? Is it bringing them anything that's valuable commercially, technologically, or are they just wasting money? Are they actually going down dark paths that will lead them to nowhere? Then if you have some evidence, then you have a conversation, because the Chinese are very practical. They are doing these things for a reason. And so our question is not whether China is abiding by rules. We just assume that they're not. We assume that it's discriminatory and unfair, but we don't think that's an interesting question. And instead we want to say, what is the consequences, commercial, technological consequences of what the Chinese are doing? And then on that basis decide what American policy should be, what the strategy of multinationals that interact with China should be. Not the legal question. That's, you can let your lawyers and lobbyists deal with that. We got plenty of other people in Washington to do that. Now, to understand whether China is being successful, one way you might go about doing that is looking for Chinese companies that are successful. These are some very successful Chinese companies in high tech. Probably some of you here use their products. You might even have WeChat on your phone, which works way better than most other messaging systems and includes everything else. You can buy your shopping, travel, hotels, send money to other people through WeChat. Oppo, you probably don't know, but it's the 5th most popular phone brand in the world right now.
Stereo equipment, I have Oppo.
Okay, yeah. And,
so they've infiltrated my house.
Okay, cool, excellent. People have probably heard of Alibaba, right? So BYD, a Chinese electric car maker, etc. So, but this is not a good way to reach a final conclusion about whether China is being successful in what it's doing, because this is just a handful of companies that I didn't randomly pick. I picked them because I knew them, and so I have no idea whether these companies are representative of China as a whole, or are they the exceptions to the rule. So you have to look for some other way to say, to decide, is China successful in what it's doing. Now, another thing that you might do would be to look at some case studies of some industries, right, where bunches of companies are involved, and then based on those case studies, you might draw some conclusions. So, I don't know if you're aware of this, but an excellent example of this, probably not as important a case as you would have thought, has to do with the pen, which all of you have. And you probably, all of your pens are from China, because they make 2 billion pens a year. So, but it's really interesting, the tip of the pen, which is called the nib, they can't make that. It's too difficult because it requires a specialized machining that you have to be really refined. If it's just one way or the other, it screws up. So a few years ago, when I realized that they were having this problem making the tip, I thought, well, you know, the Chinese are going to form a leading small group on nibs, and they'll put the state authority behind it, and then they'll solve this problem. So they didn't form a leading small group, but Li Keqiang, the premier, personally was interested in this, and they found some companies to give 17 million US dollars to, the equivalent of 17 million, I think it was 100 million renminbi, to do research to develop this technology, so they didn't have to import from Switzerland and Japan, the two places where this is made. So lo and behold, last year they figured this thing out, and now they can make it on their own. And so, but there's a question. Was that 17 million well spent? Should they have taken that money and put it on something else? What's wrong with importing nibs from Switzerland and Japan if they're already, if they make them well, why not devote your resources to something else if you don't have comparative advantage in it, right? So they're basic economics. So that's really the nib of the question. All right. Yes. So, sorry. I think I could be a stand-up comedian. My wife doesn't. And obviously you guys don't either. So, any case, so that's really at the heart of the issue, the money that the Chinese are investing in different industries, does that make sense? Is it worth it? All right? So, now you can go industry by industry, but there's lots of different industries. And that's still, if you are a good social scientist, you can look for core variables that might differentiate the different industries. I did that actually in my dissertation research when I looked at lobbying in different sectors. So you can test a certain theory that way, but it's not, it lets you test a theory, but then not necessarily tell you in a broad scheme definitely what's going on. So there might be other ways to do this research, and so what we decided as a first cut would be to look at general innovation indices that apply not only to China, but to lots of countries. These are several of the indices that exist. Different organizations in the US, Europe, and Asia generate these indices that have a whole variety of components about innovation in different countries. And so one of the good things about this is it's cross-national, and they have data over time. So that is, for us, a convenient potential source of data to look at this question of where the Chinese are going. And so our first report starts by trying to use this data to put China in global context. So here's what the initial data find. And let me say a little bit about this. First thing you'll notice is that these lines are all over the graph. Now the way these innovation indices work is they give you two types of numbers. They tell you a raw score, usually somewhere between 0 and 100, which is they've got a bunch of indices that are weighted, have certain weights, and then they add up to a score. And so they give you a raw score. They also give you a rank. They tell you what that country's rank is relative to other countries that are in the study that they're looking at. And so they don't all have the same number of countries, but they all use essentially a basic scoring system. Some go from 0 to 7, so we just normalize that on a 0 to 100. That way we can compare across all the different indices. We started with 12, and we ended up with 5. We thought 7 were a waste of time. And you're going to find that we think some of these also aren't very good. If you, let me see, does that do that? Yeah, that does, wow. But this doesn't like it. You'll see the top one is the National Innovation Index, which is very high there, the nice green line. That's high because that's China's own index. That's the Chinese government's own one. So of course they're going to choose components of that index that make China look good. Like how many patents do you have? How many academic papers have you published? How much money is spent? How many engineers do you have? Nice raw absolute numbers that make China look great. So that's a terrible index. We're not going to use that because it's biased in an obvious way that's not going to be helpful to really understanding the question. At the bottom, the Global Creativity Index. Now that's put out by the University of Toronto's Business School. And they're at the bottom because the way that they look at innovation is not a good fit for China. The Global Creativity Index has 3 components. One is about technology, another measure is about talent, and the third is about tolerance. So in terms of technology, they rank China 14th. In terms of talent, they rank China about 68th. It has to do with like the percentage of workers that go to college, the percentage of workers that are involved in creative activities, things like that. In terms of tolerance, China is almost at the bottom globally compared to everybody else, because their view of tolerance is, what's your views about minorities, people of different sexual orientations, etc. China ranks very low on those measures, and so they're at the bottom here. I find this not a very helpful index because China's whole effort is to challenge the idea that you need a progressive social and political environment to innovate technologically. So it gives China a low score, but it's not actually measuring what they're doing. It's saying we begin with this assumption about how innovation occurs, that it's creative minds working in their garages, coming up with all sorts of ideas, regardless of the state of mind that you're in. And the weirder your life is, maybe the better. The more unique or distinctive it is, the better. And so the Chinese are challenging that. They're using a very different approach, and therefore we think we're going to continue to track it, but we don't think necessarily it's the best way to understand what's going on in China. Bloomberg is also up there. I don't think that's because Bloomberg wants to do a lot of business in China. The components of their index actually are a lot like the National Innovation Index. I don't spend a lot of time looking at it because we only have 2 points of data, 2 years of data, which is, I'd rather go with something else. So we end up going with the Global Innovation Index, that blue line. The Global Competitiveness Index comes out from the World Economic Forum, and it's entirely subjective. It's just based on surveys of business people around the world. The Global Innovation Index is better because it has 103 components, most of which are physical measures, some of which are judgments based on surveys, but it has a really nice mix of different components. If you look at these indices by instead of by absolute score but by rank, what you'll see is again a wide variation, and what you'll see is China improving in terms of its rank. An absolute score, China sort of dipped down after the global financial crisis because to avoid the worst problems of the global financial crisis, China decided to spend 4 trillion renminbi, which didn't go into high tech, it went into real estate infrastructure. And so their score went down. Starting around 2012 or 13, they started to turn things around, deploying money in other directions. And so you see this general uptick since then. And that's affected their ranking. Their ranking has improved overall. So if we just focus now on the Global Innovation Index and we put the others to the side, we can come back to them if you'd like. Here's what China looks like in comparative perspective over the last, from 2007 to 2016. So we've got 9 years of data here. I wish we had more, but academics and think tankers just thought of doing this over the last decade. So these don't exist much before then. If some enterprising grad student wants to create earlier data, then that would be a big help to the world. And then you could look over a much longer period of time. You're going to get very tired doing this, though, I can imagine. So, but anyway, I know building data sets is a big part of graduate school. But the data here, again, it's that same line I showed you before in the first graph, but with several other countries added. What it shows is that China is separating itself from the rest of the developing world and major emerging economies, and it's approaching the levels of advanced industrialized economies, but still got some distance to go. It's still not quite up there with the others, but definite separation from India, Brazil, Russia, others that are big and powerful that you think might, the other parts of the BRICS. If you look in terms of rank, it's essentially the same story. Again, China doesn't look anywhere like India, Russia, Brazil, and it's looking much more like other countries that we typically associate as high-tech countries, like South Korea, Germany, Japan, and the U.S. So again, this isn't got all the countries in there. If I put all 128 on there, it'd still look like this. But this, with 8 lines instead of 128, makes it a little easier to see. Yes?
I'm just curious, why do, in 2007 and 8, why does South Korea and China diverge, so dramatically in those first few years?
I wish I knew the sources of the South Korean data better. It may be that the way that they came through the global financial crisis was a whittling away of companies through bankruptcy. South Korea in the Asian financial crisis a decade before had undergone a significant liberal reform, reorganizing their chaebol, and so it's just possible that they did a better job. And this is the ranks. If we go back to the scores, you'll see the South Koreans, again, they improved some. They improved better than the others in absolute terms. So that explains the change in rank. Now, an important issue isn't just the final score, which shows China improving, but a key question is China getting its money's worth, or its investment worth? And to answer that question, you need to take these innovation indices and divide them into 2 parts. The inputs that go into generating innovation, like money, human capital, and looking at what they get out of that. New knowledge, new commercial improvements, market share, value added. And so a good thing about the Global Innovation Index is it nicely does that for us. And so these are the raw scores for the input side of the equation. I think it's about 70 of the 103 measures that combine. And again, what you see here is a very nice upwardly sloping curve from 2012 that shows that China's, on the input side, they're throwing a lot more into the hopper for innovation. All right. Now, if you look at the output side, again, China's the red line. Why would it be anything else? It's a much more bumpy line. It is, there's some variation in it, but it is not moving up as the inputs line is moving up. And I guess I should have put those both on there for you on a single graph for you to see. But if you just go back, you can see the red line here is a nice upwardly sloping one, and this one is not. So that raises the question: is China is it an efficient innovator? Is it getting what it should in terms of the outputs based on what's going on in the input side? And now this is going to be a difficult challenge for anyone to analyze, because there's a useful question: is how long should it take things that go in the inputs to translate into output score, improvements in output? And there's no good answer for that. Should it take 1 year? Should it take 2? Should it take 3? Should it take 5? We don't know. Maybe China's output line will start to fly up, and then we'll think, well, then there was it took maybe 5 years for all those inputs to translate into good output. But then the question is, would 5 years be? Would that show that China is a fast innovator, that it translated those inputs quickly, or would that show that it's just like everybody else, or that it's very slow? If we took the graphs, the lines for everyone else, would those show it was really only 2 years or 1 year? So this isn't a puzzle that anybody has answered. No one knows how long it ought to take, and whether a certain period of time is fast or slow relative to everybody else. Yes?
Your statements there prompt me to ask, when you think of U.S. investment in R&D, we put relatively a lot of money into kind of basic science, I think,
yes,
more than industry and more than a lot of countries,
yes,
which has a long time before it pays off.
That's right.
Does China do any of that, or is it pretty much near-term kind of investment?
They do some. and you're anticipating exactly where we're going, because what I wanted, because the rest of the talk is about showing you on the input side what they're doing, and then on the output side what they're getting. And my basic point and the conclusion of the report is that this is a very inefficient process in China, and that's why we call China a fat tech dragon. Now, we didn't call them, that's the title of the report if you remember the first screen. We didn't call the report Fat Tech Panda. We thought about this, because if it was a fat tech, pandas are supposed to be fat. So that wouldn't make sense.
They're not very innovative either.
You know, well, they know how to eat bamboo.
Yeah.
Right?
Nothing new there.
So, but dragons are supposed to be sort of muscle ripped, don't look anything like me. Right? So we think that China is innovating, but not in a very efficient way. And so I wanted to explain to you why we reached this conclusion by teasing apart what's going on in the input side and then what we see on the output side. And then wrap up by saying, you know, what are the implications for everybody else? Well, for China and for everyone else. So I'm going to focus, I mentioned that the two big kinds of inputs are money and human talent. I'm going to focus mostly on the money side. We can go back to human talent if you want. It's got some interesting changes, but the financial side of things in China are, I think, actually more interesting right now. So most folks who follow China are familiar with this graph, that China is throwing a lot more money into R&D as a relative percentage of its economy. 2.1% of GDP in 2016 puts China squarely in the middle of OECD countries, right? And if you made this an absolute number, it'd be a tenfold increase since 2000 in absolute dollar terms. So they are spending a ton on R&D, way more than they ever have before. And by the time they get to 2020, it'll probably be 2.5% of GDP. Now, I was concerned by that upwardly sloping line. It looks so nice and neat. My general view is that all Chinese data is a bunch of bull. That it's all a bunch of lies. And that you ought not to accept any of it. It's why I travel to China a lot and interview companies and industry associations and lawyers and engineers, because I don't believe the official data. So I thought, well, let's go check. So we went to the Bloomberg database, which is really expensive. Luckily, we could. CSIS has a subscription, and we milked that for everything it was worth. I had interns working for months to make this single chart, what we went is we looked at every single company listed in the Bloomberg index that was a Chinese company, and from these 7 other countries. And all of these are listed companies. That's what Bloomberg database covers in their corporate database. And we look to see if they got data on how much they spend in R&D and what their sales are. And if a company reports those two things, they get into our list. We got 25,000 lines of data through all these companies over the course of that 11 years. I think it actually ends up being more but in any case, we got thousands and thousands of lines of data for this. And we went and just calculated by hand what the R&D intensity is of companies. So we went ground up instead of top down. And you can see there's the Chinese line, that red line again. I'm not going to be able to explain any of the others with any level of sophistication. But what you see is that nice upwardly sloping line that Chinese companies spend around 1.6% of sales on R&D. Now sales, that's different than GDP or whatever. But this line shows you that the Chinese official data is basically accurate. That they weren't lying. Or that Bloomberg is lying too. Or that that companies lie when they give data to Bloomberg. But anyway, at least they're lying consistently, or this confirms the reality. I think basically it's probably true, that the trend is true, the absolute numbers, you tell me. There's reasons why Chinese companies might fudge things, but I don't think the reasons for them to fudge things now are much larger than they were several years ago. So I think probably the direction of where this thing's going is probably accurate. I do remember going to some companies where they showed me their R&D center, and I looked and it had some nice equipment, but the lights were turned out. Nothing was going on. I think that's less common now. So they are spending more money, but are they spending it well? Now China spends about 75% of money that goes into R&D comes from companies in China. But that's an overstatement, because even that 75% of money isn't just simply directed based on where companies individually want to spend their money. They are following industrial policy guidelines, because in addition to potential funding and subsidies from the state, they're also getting other types of policy benefits from directing their money in the direction of industrial policy. So that's, and 75%, which is about similar to what the R&D expenditures are in the United States and other places, but nevertheless, it's much less privately driven. In addition, to get to Professor McNauer's specific question, 85% of R&D spending in China is on the D, is on development. That last 15% is on research. 10% of that 15 is applied research. 5% is on basic research. So that's a very small number relative, and it's way smaller than in the United States. So the Chinese are involved in doing R&D for today. They want to see commercial impact very soon when they are spending this money. They are not spending for the super long term. China does have like supercomputer projects, monster satellite things. It's a very tiny part of what they spend money on. Another sign that the Chinese are worried less about basic technological innovation and instead about commercial consequences is their venture capital market. And I had a chance to interview some venture capitalists in China, foreign ones, Chinese ones, and then collect some data. And Chinese venture capitalists are the least adventurous venture capitalists I've run into. They do not like to invest in things that aren't proven to be commercial winners.
They don't like risk.
Yeah, yes, exactly. As one told me, we don't invest in 0 to 1, we invest in 1 to 100. They don't look for something that's brand new and make the first one of it and then sell it. They like for something that already exists and they scale it up. Which makes sense. China's a big monster market, so scale matters. This graph shows you the percentage of projects that yield a return by venture capitalists in China over the last decade. And it shows you that the proportion of projects that yield a return in high-tech industries is about the same as in traditional industries. That shows me that high-tech investment is really in traditional stuff. Because in the United States and other economies with mature venture capital, the percentage of projects that yield a return in high-tech are always far lower. Because there's way more risk. Because it's unproven technologies. So you're adding something new to the equation that makes it a lot harder. So this shows you that a lot of Chinese supposed venture capital in high-tech is really into real estate. It may be cloud, but it's going to be cloud buildings that hold cloud servers as opposed to new cloud investment. So this raises questions about where the money is going. So China's spending more. It's diversifying the sources of funding, but it's going into things that generate commercial success, not necessarily technological success. Let's look at the output side of things. Let's look at the first important type of output, which is knowledge creation. New technologies, new ideas. I think most folks, if I put up there a line showing you how many patents the Chinese file each year, again, you'd see that nice upwardly sloping curve. The Chinese are the world's leading filers of patents now, world's leading filers of copyrights. They're catching up in trademarks. They filed about 1.2 million patents last year. And they're filing everywhere else around the world. They are filing left and right. I've talked to the folks at the USPTO. They in some ways are jealous because now the Chinese patent authorities are busier than USPTO. They got way more work. And folks go to patent first in China, in fact. But there's a good question. What's the value of all those patents? And what we found is that the value of those patents is really tiny. If this is really important, good technology, the value of these patents would be a lot higher. So we have several measures that show us how low the value of Chinese patents are. The first is licensing. China's economy is about half the size of the US economy. Their domestic IP licensing market is about 1/100th the size of the US economies, of our market here. So super small. We also looked at Chinese participation in global trade in licensing, which is what this shows you. Chinese bring, I guess a couple years ago, the most recent year the IMF, which generates this data, has available, and China brought in about $1 billion in licensing fees in 2015. But they paid out $22 billion in licensing fees, which is a lot. Now, if you went to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce down the street, they'd tell you China needs to pay a lot more, right? Because they're ripping. And I was just at a USTR hearing on Chinese intellectual property rights behavior, and there was a lot of criticism that China isn't paying nearly enough, ripping off folks left and right. So, but if you just go according to the reported numbers, what's on record, you could calculate a ratio of what you get to what you pay. And China, for every dollar that it pays out, it gets a nickel. So that's about 0.05, which is the small little red little square down there. The United States is at the opposite end. We went and looked at every country that's a major trader in IP licensing fees. The U.S. is got the best. It gets $3 for every dollar it pays out. We went and looked back over a couple decades. Luckily, the IMF has this data over a couple days. And China's ratio has not budged an inch. It's been the same place for 20 years. So they are not getting more, they are not turning this around. Now, if you were Xi Jinping, you would be like, hey, we are fixing this number, right? We're either going to pay less or charge more, right? So, but there's only one country on the planet that has a worse ratio than China. I didn't put it on here because it's South Africa. It's also at the very bottom. It's been there, is not moved an inch. So, in any case, this is one example of low value of IP, licensing fees. Secondly, in mergers and acquisitions, when you go buy a company, you look at, you're going to figure out what the value of that company is. You're going to look at all the stuff that's sitting around that you can bang on, right? You're going to look at the people in the room. You're going to look at their IP portfolio. You're going to open up and say, what patents do they have? Copyright? What's their trademark worth? Their brand worth? And deals, I talked to a bunch of lawyers that do this stuff for a living, and the consistent answer always is that when you acquire a Chinese company, the value of their IP is almost zero. It doesn't matter what IP they have. You don't acquire a Chinese company because they have IP. You acquire them because they've got licenses, political connections, ability to manufacture at scale, stuff that you don't have. You don't care about their IP, unless you're just buying it defensively to get it out of the way. When Chinese companies acquire American companies or European companies, as they've been doing at record rates, they care a lot about the IP. And in fact, those patent portfolios matter more than anything, right? So if you look in terms of the value of these portfolio patents and IP, it's very low in China. Third and final measure, patent infringement. So if Tom invents something and I rip it off because he's got all these great ideas, I never can have great ideas. If we're in China and we're both Chinese and we go into court, the average, he sues me. The average penalty, the reward that he's going to get in China is 98,000 renminbi. Let's divide that by 6.5. It's about 16,000 US dollars. That's the average award. In the United States, the average award is $7.3 million. That shows you that patents don't add up to a hill of beans in China. I'm going to happily steal other people's patented technology in China because the penalty for doing so is so pitiful. So if you look in terms of knowledge creation in China, they're not getting a lot for all of that money. Right? Now we can go to the final, where I started earlier, looking at those companies. What are they getting for all this on the commercial side? You can look at individual companies, and you can be impressed by their technology. That's one way of measuring commercial success. It doesn't necessarily tell you if these companies' success, though, is based on the technology that they've invented and commercialized, or if it's based on something else. You have to look at other sources of data. A useful, important type of data is manufacturing value added. So not what happens just when you assemble stuff or an OEM. What stuff do you put in there that's new? Right? That's the value added to that manufacturing. And manufacturing value added in China as a proportion of the entire economy has been falling, not rising. Now, if I gave you another curve, which was the absolute value of that manufacturing value added, that's been going up. But as a share of the total economy in China, it's been falling. It's been falling in part because of China's services sector, which has been growing really rapidly. So that has been growing faster than any part of the economy. And value added, it's a very mixed picture in terms of manufacturing and what that means. You can also look, beside looking at value added, you can look at high-tech exports from domestic Chinese companies. If this investment is yielding important returns, it ought to show up in Chinese exports data. And to some extent it is. The overall average of high-tech exports from purely domestic Chinese companies is now about 20%. That's a low number. I mean, China's got a lot of joint ventures in high-tech and a lot of wholly foreign-owned enterprises in China that export in China. But you can see in some sectors, domestic Chinese companies are starting to export a much larger share of what's produced in China. So this shows some progress in most industries, but there's still a ways to go. So let me bring it full circle and try to say what all this means. And I'm not going to depend particularly on this slide. So I think if you wanted to, you could tell a couple different stories, at least, about where China is going. I mean, the story that I've told you so far is that China's chucking a lot into the hopper in terms of money, but they're not getting a lot out in terms of technological innovations. If you look at patents, other measures of novel technology, there's not a lot there. What you see instead is big improvements in market share, in overall sales volume, in brands that carry Chinese labels, which isn't necessarily a consequence of technological innovation. Those companies have been successful not by creating brand new technologies, but by adapting existing technologies, customizing, integrating existing technologies together in ways that haven't been done before, but not by coming up with the iPhone or other brand new things that you've never heard of. Incremental, modest innovations, and by massive protection. China's market is massively protected through tariffs, through non-tariff barriers, government procurement, in many different ways, right? And so all that is what has helped give China the success, whatever success it has had so far. And to me, that looks like an improvement, but a very inefficient approach to innovating, right? So that would be one way to sum this up, and I think for us it's an important conclusion. However, there's another way to do this, and didn't get the same answer from everyone we talked to. And there's another way to spin the story. It's a way the Chinese government spins the story, and a way a lot of folks who are in the venture capital business spin the story. And some economists who say it really doesn't matter that the Chinese aren't coming up with the best new X or Y or Z, but in China it makes sense to incrementally innovate because you have such a huge market. And it doesn't matter that they are spending a ton of money. That looks like waste. What really matters is that they grab market share as quickly as they can, build up their profitability, learn, gain experience, and then down the road it will come a time when innovating brand new stuff makes much better business sense. And they'll be better prepared to do it. So a good example that folks with this view give is in cellular phones. In the late 1990s, when I was still at Brookings with Professor Lieber, and we had China 2G was the type of cellular service that people had. American companies and European companies dominated that. The Chinese just paid licensing fees to get into 2G. And then for 3G, the Chinese came up with their own standard, their own alternative to the American and European models. It was a crappy, horrible alternative. They forced the Chinese companies, the telecom companies, to buy this technology and for people to have these cell phones that only worked in China. But they learned a little bit. And then you got to 4G, where we are now, and the Chinese are competing head-to-head with everybody in 4G, right, and doing pretty well. And now we're working on 5G, which will carry a lot more data, and you can do just about anything you want. And the Chinese are at the front of the pack in 5G. Most of the value of the patents that will be connected to 5G are owned by Chinese companies. They'll be way out front. So if you look at this as learning over time, if you see comparative advantage is not static but dynamic, and governments and others can change that by intervening, then what the Chinese are doing makes sense. And given the fact that they've got a massive pool of savings, that they're not about to run out of money, given that they've got their own source of political legitimacy, their own nukes, their own veto at the UN Security Council, they don't really need to listen to anybody else. They can do it their own way. They could not do this if they were Kenya or Chile or Costa Rica. They'd get squashed like a bug, and they'd run out of money. But being China, they can do it. They can try to do it this way. So that's the alternative explanation. I think that there's a lot of holes in that explanation, but it's kind of where it's sort of the continued argument that we're going to have and analyze over the rest of this project. What's it mean for everybody else? For Chinese companies, it means everywhere you go in the world, you will be carrying that label of technology that is protected by industrial policy. And it'll make it hard for you to do deals anywhere in the world because everyone is going to be challenging you. If you're multinationals, you have to figure out, if you're going to operate in China, how much technology you're willing to give away, whether you're willing to accept the system and hand over a bunch, whether you're going to tinker around the edges, or whether you're going to fight the Chinese tooth and nail and try and break up this type of system that they have in place. And if you're the US government and others, you've got the same choice as multinationals to go along to get along as this juggernaut plows ahead, or to try and force it to marginally adjust, or to really break it up. And we're seeing that debate occur right here in Washington, and it's occurring right inside the middle of the Trump administration as you look at the fights between Bannon and Peter Navarro, who think China is the evil empire and needs to be destroyed. And then you have Gary Cohn and the National Economic Council and others who think, we just need to make China modestly adapt and adjust. But it's, as the Chinese say, win-win. And then you see folks in the middle like Bob Lighthizer, the U.S. Trade Representative, who want to get very tough on China, but think that there's a way to find some middle ground. But you have to push them first. So that's the middle of the debate that we're in right now. And I don't think it's going away. It's going to be around for quite a while. Chinese aren't going to be giving up on this. Right now, I'm really enjoying working on electric vehicles, but we're going to be doing semiconductors, artificial intelligence, commercial aircraft, and new drug discovery. As